The last one of the day, we really need to call upon the Argentines to really bring us home, and I can think of no better group of people to do so. So, we're going to do this panel for 45 minutes, and then we're going to adjourn with a closing session where we bring everything together, and it's all going to become clear.
Do you mind
if we use your...
There are two of them here. I've got one.
I have probably an old. I have. No, but that should work. No. Yes. They are changing them so that we buy new ones, but not that often.
Is there a way to shoot it from here onto this
Para que no te salte de la
Así. ¿Dónde decía?
América decía.
Uy, chequeé el spelling de todas menos de la carátula.
No lo ve.
¿No lo ve? Capaz que cambió la
tecnología. Sí, no, creo que no,
Pero qué raro.
It's not seeing the other display. So I think we need to switch
You have
up.
the key, the flash thing. So, okay, we should change the computer. I have to change the type. Wait. Oops. It's not, no, todavía no. No, es que no lo puedo.
I think that's...
Se está justo no sé por qué va. Bueno, se supone que tenga que ser short, que se grabó 2 veces.
But I don't really have to want her.
No, era enorme.
It's a short?
Sí.
Sure.
Ah. Anda, Víctor. O sea que no hay cócteles.
Thank you.
All right.
Why don't we postpone closing remarks until we get to the next?
I like that.
It could be a toast.
I like where you're coming from.
And if everybody's drunk, nobody will care. So.
Exactly.
Hopefully the Greek chorus has more.
Finally, the Greek chorus has a good idea.
And it was
It's
just
the
one
whole
sentence.
day.
Exactly. Greek chorus. And I've been using the Greek chorus in vain. No longer. I'm pro-Greek chorus now. All right. Are we all ready and assembled and ready to roll? Okay. So the Argentine panel has arrived. Finally, we've been looking forward to it all day, and this is what we have. We have a paper by Paola Bergallo. It's entitled Complementarities and Mismatches in Reasoning.
Okay.
It's changed. And our own Ariel Dulitzky, professor at law school and director of Human Rights Clinic. Among other things, there's another title which is listed here. But anyway, without further ado, Paola.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I know you are all tired, and now I know I'm going to bore you, so sorry for that. A couple of clarifications. This is a project that is just starting, so it's in a very, very preliminary stage. It's a larger project. It's a project about gender and constitutionalism in Latin America. It's part of research that tries to look at the law and the context of its development. So unlike the prior papers, I'm going to look to the text, to some important statutes, and also to court decisions from the High Supreme Courts. And I'm also going to try to supplement the research with empirical information regarding just one little question, which is the compliance with the court decision. So that's the larger project, to look at gender in constitutional law in Latin America. The time frame of the project is shorter, and it's also more contemporary because it's a new development. So that's another part of the larger context of what I'm going to share with you, which is a minor part of it, one that I'm just beginning to develop, which has a focus on the relationship of the local constitutional law and international human rights law in the particular issue of abortion in Latin America. I'm going to make the clarification now that the paper is actually not about the debate on abortion in the substance of the discussion which is going on in the region. It's using abortion, which is a subject in which I've been working basically in several legal reform initiatives within Argentina and some regional projects. It's using abortion as the setting to look at the way in which law works in these levels, in which I mentioned to you the constitutional level, but also the statutory and the judicial contributions of our courts. Another important dimension of the issue, of the focus, is that I'm going to look at the domestication of international law through the courts and judicial impacts today, and I'm going to look especially to formal and informal international law, which is another of the differences with the work we have been listening to. I'm not only focuses on the treaties, which are actually less relevant in a sense to the conversation. I'm focusing on soft law and all the developments that since 1994 have been touching upon abortion issues at the level of international law, both within the UN system and the regional system. So I have all these categories to distinguish, so I know it's going to be very boring and very legalistic. Actually, the literature in which I'm working is the literature that deals with the transnational dialogue, but I'm interested in observing it through court decisions and also empirically in terms of the compliance with the court decisions. So I think that many of the literature on the transnational dialogue has been criticized because of its focus on the courts and the reception on the courts discourse of the domestication or the bottom-up influences. And I'm interested in adding an empirical component to that conversation about compliance or impacts of the judicial decisions on the issue. So all these clarifications, I'm not going to get into the substance, but I think they are necessary to understand part of the initial idea that I have. This is a brief summary of the trend of legal formal changes that you can see in Latin America regarding abortion laws in the last 4 years. Is, I think, important to follow why the Colombian and the Argentine case studies that I'm proposing to share in the paper, I'm going to share just the Argentinian case today, have something to teach to the whole region. And basically, you know that abortion laws are classified in different ways. There are those who totally ban abortion formally. There are others who provide for certain exceptions in cases of risk for the life of the woman, rape, etc. And these are called model of indications to regulate abortion. And then you have the abortion on demand laws or periodic laws. So if you look at Latin American laws in the last 40 years, you see that there has been 4 different trends. By the early 70s, most of Latin American laws provided for exceptions to the criminalization of abortion. A majority of them back to the Cuban law, in practice actually, because it was applied as a law authorizing abortion on demand, and the El Salvadorian law that totally prohibited abortion. Then the rest of the whole region was permitting abortion in several different exceptions. If you look at the last decade, you see that several countries have moved to formally totally ban abortion. Others are with their model of indication, and Cuba remains there almost alone, authorizing abortion on demand. However, the yellow box that you see is a slow movement that was increasing in the last decade. That is the one in which I'm interested in. These are cases in which we are shifting from the formal laws permitting abortions, but in fact, de facto total bans, which was actually the case in the whole region. So if you were to look to the first column, in fact, they were all red. So we used to have a majority of countries with laws permitting abortion in several cases, but in most of the region, they were not enforced. So in the last decade, we have some countries, Mexico City and then the states of Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, and gradually we are adding Brazil, but much slowly, that are countries that are trying to enforce the indications. And this is a very important thing because I think that one could look at the developments of international law and national law about their contribution in 2 dimensions, about what international and national law have contributed to the framing of the abortion issue in terms of which are the justification for permitting or prohibiting abortion, and enforcement issues, which are basically focused on the enforcement of the model of indications in all places of the world where it has been in the books of several countries. So if you look at international human rights law, throughout the last 20 years, you see that both the international human rights system and the inter-American human rights system have produced several different decisions or reports, soft law, formal law, contributions, where they have clarified a very basic issue that was not shared in practice in all the countries of Latin America that had a formal or informal total ban, which is that there should be a balancing between the right to life of the fetus and women's rights. This is not the framing of the understanding in the countries that totally ban abortion, either formally, like Chile, El Salvador, Nicaragua, or Honduras, or informally, like all the countries in the orange box. So the framing of the conversation in the region assumed that there was a total ban grounded in an absolute right to life that could not be balanced or proportionately assessed with women's rights. And this is an important shift at the international human rights level and at the national human rights level, as we will see. Another consensus in terms of framing at the international human rights level is that there should be a minimum number of exceptions to the criminalization. So the balancing ends implying that when there is at least a risk for the life of the woman, and other situations in certain precedents in international law, this includes rape, or in others it includes the cases of fetal malformation or other situations in which we know that the fetus is going to die inevitably. And so that's another important point. And then there are certain framing issues within international law that concern with exceptions that are already in the books, and international human rights law makes recommendations to interpret the exception, like with the health exception, more broadly than it has been the local practice. Then there is a huge number of other precedents, recommendations, decisions concerning the actual enforcement of the exceptions. And this is an important thing because it's part of the development of international human rights law, but also it has played, I think, a very significant role in the local developments within court decisions in Argentina and in Colombia. And I think that this is what is a specificity of the region, the fact that courts had to devote a significant part of their decisions about abortion to promote enforcement by health services, health professionals, public policy makers of the supply of legal abortions, those abortions that are actually permitted in the criminal codes of the region since 1920, in some cases like the Argentine case. I think that this is a specificity of the judicial intervention in the debate about abortion, which relates to the context of legality in Latin America and how our political actors play into the conversation about abortion when it is legally permitted in terms of the criminal code. This is a very important difference when you compare the European court decisions in Germany or in Spain, for the case, where there was not a huge debate about enforcement, or non-debate about enforcement at all. If you look at the Argentinian case, you can see that there has been an evolution of the law in practice. In fact, we have still the same criminal code rule that was enforced since 1921, which was a very liberal one. It permitted abortion in case of risk for the life, the health of a woman, and rape. However, for most of the century, we haven't had access to legal abortions. We didn't have neither a public or a private legal supply of those abortions. And this is what, in the last decade, the women's movement and different actors have been fighting for, aside from the fight for abortion on demand law, which is also part of what the movement has been fighting for. But I think it's interesting because this is a space opened by politics when you can't have a conversation about law reform, and it's a conversation that is getting harder because, as you know, we have the Pope that is very interested in these issues, and it's fighting for political power with politicians in the region. So it's also part of the context. So part of the investment of the women's movement has been in this very conservative strategy, which is about establishing the need for balancing as a framing issue, which was not accepted in practice by none of the actors involved, and also establishing the enforcement of the actual formal laws that were not being put in play. So what we see in the last 2 decades, it's a shift from an initial moment in which constitutional law conversations about abortion were all about an absolute right to life in the fetus and no references to women's rights. And then at the constitutional level, we have seen in the last decade a shift towards the balancing and also this concern with enforcement too. So there has been a parallel movement within international human rights law and at the local level in these 2 dimensions. Now we accept the balancing, the minimum conversation about certain exceptions, and the enforcement problems. And the Supreme Court of Argentina has had an important contribution to this conversation in 2012 in a decision considering these 2 aspects. It has declared that the 1921 law is constitutional, and it has also made several requests or exhortation to the government to put in place services of legal abortions. What has international human rights to do with this? In all these moments, both in the first initial decisions that were arguing for the total ban on abortion and an absolute right of the fetus, international human rights played a very central role. The same as in the new decisions that are accepting the framing of the balancing and also the enforcement issue. So we see an example where you can see something that is quite counterintuitive, I think, when we think about human rights influence, is that human rights have been used both to totally ban abortion, and then now to permit several exceptions and request and fight for the enforcement of those indications. Okay, so you see this cycle within the Argentine case, and if you look at the international human rights law, you see also that cycle. But if you put some dates in the moments in which the decisions have been adopted, this is something that I do in a table that is not red, but it's in the last part of my paper, you can see that there are certain complementarities in the way that international law is used at the local level, but very many mismatches. Just to give you an example, and I finished there. With the balancing idea and the Inter-American system. In 1981, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights issued a decision upon a consultation from a U.S. organization in a case that is called Baby Boy, saying that the Article 4.1 of the Inter-American Convention that protects life in general since conception should not be interpreted as prohibiting the abortion on demand laws of the U.S. because it didn't request a total ban on abortion. However, that precedent was not cited or used or recepted in Latin American laws in any of the conversations that took place, at least until the Argentine Supreme Court in 2012 or the Colombia Supreme Court in 2006 accepted the balancing. So from 1981, we have an Inter-American precedent given ideas to interpret the key article of the convention that was used to justify in part the total ban, and we didn't have a citation of that reference for more than 20 years. Last year, in 2012, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights finally got to issue its first decision interpreting Article 4.1. 30 years later, to say just that the balancing was compatible with the Article 4.1 in a case against Costa Rica, in a case about in vitro fertilization. So the system took 20 or more years to clarify a very basic legal issue of the conversation. And it has not addressed yet in the court the issues of enforcement. However, it has addressed several cases and reports dealing with the issue of enforcement. So you see, if you look at the influences at the legal, formal and informal documents, you see that there are complementarities in certain cases and mismatches. And, well, there are many things to read about them, and I'm interested in the consequences, both for the arguments at the local courts, but also to the work of the Inter-American Commission and what it could do to take seriously these conversations. That's it, sorry.
Great. Okay, Ariel. Thank you. Just to start with the disclaimer, I have nothing to say about abortion. So I'm not going to comment on abortion. I will comment more on the interplay between constitutional law and international human rights law. I'm using Paola's paper that presents so many and opens so many questions. And I'm glad that Paola said that is only in her early stages of the project, because I think that has a lot of potential for development. And the first thing, and it's interesting, the cases that Paola develops that are the cases of Argentina and Colombia, and because they are in both constitutions, international human rights law is part of the Constitution. Article 93, I believe, of the Colombian Constitution says that international human rights law prevails over the domestic legal system. In the case of Argentina, certain international human rights treaties are incorporated at the level of the Constitution. So these two cases pose us the first question. Are we talking about international human rights law or constitutional law as the treaties are incorporated into the constitutional order? So what we discussed this morning about the incorporation of international human rights law, it appears that here in the cases of Argentina and Colombia, at least this division is diluted, and everything is part of the constitutional order. So that's the first question that it's important, because when the Supreme Court or the Constitutional Court, in the case of Colombia, are doing constitutional or judicial review, they are not looking only at the compatibility of any state action with the Constitution, but also with international human rights law. And that changes a lot the debate and the possibilities that international human rights law brings to the debate. The second point that you make, and it's very interesting, is that you mentioned, you use the cases of Argentina and Colombia and show how international human rights law play at least a relevant role in the debate on abortion. But at the same time, you mentioned that the cases of Chile and Honduras, and you only mentioned them at passing, the Supreme Court in those countries use international human rights law to ban abortion. So what your case studies show forces us to rethink more about the rosy picture that we human rights defenders paint about the possibilities of human rights law. And what we see in your examples is that human rights law could be used in different ways and for different purposes. And exactly in the same matter, two courts are using international human rights law to ban or support bans on abortion, and two other courts are using to open up the possibilities of abortion. So I think that brings us back and forces us to think more about the relationship between positive influences of international human rights law, and many times are not so positive. Your paper also forces us to rethink about how we conceive international human rights law at the international level. And so far, we talk about international human rights law as if it was a coherent system and everybody in the international community interprets and uses international human rights law in the same way. Well, in fact, your cases show that that's not the case. And while in most of the other human rights areas in Latin America, the Inter-American human rights system is at the forefront of the fight for human rights issues, here the cases that you mentioned and the most relevant are the cases from the United Nations, not from the Inter-American system. You mentioned the Peruvian cases decided both by the Human Rights Committee and CIDO, and the case on Argentina decided by the Human Rights Committee, and those are, it appears, to be the most relevant ones. And when you go to the Inter-American system, you couldn't find a single case on abortion. Only the baby boy that is on the U.S. Is 81, it's not the American Convention, it's the American Declaration, it has a lot of disclaimers. The cases that you found were a friendly settlement, so a negotiation, the Paulina case on Mexico, some precautionary measures, and some thematic reports. But there is no single case decided either by the Commission or the Court on abortion. Why? Because they are not ready to do it.
Because they have them.
They had the cases, and the Commission forced the litigants and the state to negotiate a solution because it became very clear that they were not ready to issue a decision on abortion. So clearly, the one system, the United Nations, was ready to rule on these matters, not the other one. And that unpacks the conception of the international human rights systems and forces us to think more about the interaction between international human rights law and constitutional law not as something that encompasses everything, but more probably to think about particular interaction in particular areas. And in abortion, probably there is one area with one system. On amnesty laws, probably there is another possibilities in economic, social, and cultural rights, another one. So we need to unpack this relationship between international human rights law and constitutional law. On your methodology of your paper, the first one is your country studies, your cases, the cases that you study. First, you focus on Colombia and Argentina, and it appears that those are the good stories, that there is an evolution in your chart. Now they are in the yellow category, and international human rights law play a positive role there. But you don't discuss Chile and Honduras, that they are still in the red area, and international human rights law is used to ban abortion, or to support the ban on abortion. So I think that exploring that contrast and explaining why and how international human rights law is used in one country and in another, and why in one could play a positive role and in another a negative, will enrich your study. The second is, you do not study the countries that had cases decided by these international human rights bodies, like the situation in Peru or in Mexico. And so you don't study what was the effect of those international decisions on the national situation in Peru and Mexico. The second area that I think that you can push more, in page 15 of your paper, you mention the influence of the Colombian reasoning on the Argentine decision, the Argentine Supreme Court decision. I think that cross-regional dialogue that we didn't talk a lot today between Supreme Courts or constitutional courts on the interpretation of international human rights law, I think that's very interesting, because it's a dialogue between national courts on the interpretation of international law, and that will open up a lot of possibilities. The third one that it's just you mentioned at passing, but I think that is very, very important to explore more, is the federal element. And I think that there were some references this morning. You mentioned that there are at least 4 Supreme Courts of 4 provinces in Argentina, Buenos Aires, Entre Ríos, Mendoza, and Chubut, that they decided and they supported the abortion. And that was previous or at the same time that the Supreme Court opened up the space. So there is, it shows that international human rights law has different points of entry into a country. And it's not only through formal ratification or through federal implementation, but it could have a point of entry at the local level, at the provincial level. And that adds many more actors to this court. And it will be very interesting if you can say more about whether international human rights law was used by the provincial Supreme Courts or not, because for me that's very important. And if you say that part of your overall project is to have this discussion of the bottom-up judicial dialogue, and I assume that the bottom-up is coming from the domestic national courts going up, assuming that the Inter-American Court is on top of the national courts, and we can discuss that. But let's assume that that's what you have with the bottom up. I think that that's crucial, because so far the judicial dialogue that we hear and everybody embraces is domestic courts listening to these international courts, but not domestic international courts listening to national courts. At least that's not the case in the Latin American region in the Inter-American system. My question there is, what goes up, and how you decide what you listen and what you don't listen? And basically here, if we accept your proposition, everything will go up. So the Argentine decision, the Colombian decision will go up, but also the Chilean and Honduran decisions that rejected abortion. So everything goes up, and you have this process at the national level with contradictory interpretation of the same international human rights norms. And who decides? And how do you decide, and how do you use this judicial dialogue to reconcile these contradictory positions? And my concern with that, and particularly in your area, is that if the Inter-American Court is the one to decide, reconcile these tensions, the case law in terms of privacy or equality is extremely weak. So I don't know if this bottom-up call for a more egalitarian dialogue between national and inter-American courts, what result will produce at the end. I'm not sure if the court may side with the Chilean and Honduran courts rather than with the Argentine and Colombian. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, we have one final round from the Greek chorus.
So I just have two observations. One is, I think this is a nice kind of paper to end on, because it highlights in some ways one of the themes of the day, which is I think that there's very little that's universal about universal human rights. They're taken up differently in Mila's paper by domestic constitutions or in domestic law. They're interpreted and implemented differently. These norms are across different jurisdictions, and so it just, in some ways, I based on a lot of the work that's been presented today, there's a lot of reason to be skeptical about this kind of universality of these human rights principles. The other bit is just a kind of point. So I have a former colleague who studied compliance with European Court of Human Rights decisions, and what she found is basically that compliance rates are extremely low, very, very low. And so I wonder if there's reason to suspect that that's any different in the Americas. And I suspect that there isn't any reason to think that. That wouldn't be my hypothesis, because the EU structures are so much more robust in a way. So I just wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Just a sort of technical question. I'd like to know how much the Latin American jurisdictions kind of, if not listening, looking at each other, and what's the cross-fertilization?
So I just have to say I look forward to reading the final result, and I'm certainly going to be hearing it. So, great.
I wanted to pick up on the commentator's point about, the discussant's point about the cases that you're working on. And I was thinking that it would be a nice thing to do to take the same cases that Malatun used in her book Sex and the State, because she ends, she tells a political story of, the legalization of abortion in some countries and not others. And so she ends really at the point that your project begins. And if you use her same cases, then you're really in dialogue with and she has, her cases are interesting in the sense that you have some successes and some failures. And so that sort of further complicates your story, makes it interesting. How to account for those successes and failures, and yet make the additional point. She ends there. So your additional point is, but in fact they were all failures. So why do you have this sort of institutionalized change in some, why do some people allow it, but some countries allow it, but others don't? And then you're telling a sort of, you're complicating the story and you're extending the story, which I think would be a really nice move.
Q.
This is a very interesting and important study and issue for various obvious reasons, but in particular in terms of human rights scholarship and human rights politics, this is abortion is perhaps a paradigm case in which both sides mobilize human rights language. And I think an increasing number of issues fall under that category. Recently, there's a movement for aiding dying, right? Assisted suicide, euthanasia type of movement, and both sides mobilize human rights. Anti-tobacco, pro-tobacco, both sides use human rights language. So this phenomenon, this increasing number of issues talked about in terms of human rights from both sides, speaks to the power of the legitimacy of human rights in contemporary global politics and discourse. So I thought that might be one way to frame this paper and project and enhance the appeal of the project.
Thank you.
Members of the audience, any reactions? And, Victor?
Just to pick up on what Christian said, and to the extent we have cases of that sort, then it's very hard for international courts to do what they have traditionally done, which is to say, this is a convention which establishes a minimum protection. This is simply the floor. So states can go their own ways because they can improve the kinds of protections they have. But this strategy is not useful. It's not logically possible when the cases are of the sort you have just indicated. In which case, what the international court will have to do, maybe, is to be a little bit more cautious and not take cases, maybe, unless it's a moment when things are mature enough for something, to be said there. As you know, the European Court of Human Rights uses this doctrine of the margin of appreciation, which no one understands how it works. But it's one interesting way for the court to really not say much when it understands that the two sides actually can appeal to the convention, and it's not the right moment to say anything very specific. But I think I would suggest that, in studies of this sort, distinguishing two ideal types of things. One in which it's one party invoking a right, and it's only the state that invokes public interest, which can justify the constitution. And then another type of case, one party invokes a right, the other party invokes a different right. The two of them are in the relevant convention, and we have the problem we have just indicated. And abortion, of course, is exactly the example of that kind of thing.
Any other comments? Okay. Paola, you've got lots to deal with.
Thank you. I think that there are several questions that touch upon the same issue that I think it's something that I should clarify in the paper and in the conversation, is that there is a certain view of these human rights arguments that puts the arguments of those who are saying that there is an absolute right to life that should be protective in this case, totally banning abortion, and on the other side, the argument that there should be balancing. I don't think that the first argument is one that resists acceptance with a logic of argumentation within the law. So